For the better part of the last 3 years, and for all the time that the Daniel Davis Deep Dive has been on the air, we have been warning that the Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war, cannot be won by the Ukraine side. We have shifted in the last number of months to say that very graphically, militarily speaking, Ukraine cannot even prevent a loss. And therefore, the only thing that makes any sense is to seek a negotiated settlement. Well, now then, more and more battlefield realities are starting to emerge that indicate that we could be now in the final stages of the war, that Ukraine could literally be disintegrating and their defensive capabilities crumbling. At the same time, the potential for the escalation of the war is an even greater risk than probably it's been at any point since this war. And to try and to make sense of these seemingly contradictory things, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor back with us today. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Colonel Macgregor is the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, a highly decorated combat veteran and a great friend of the show. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, good to be here.
Well, listen, as I warned you a little bit before we went on camera, I got some challenging things for you to have to navigate, but these things are out there and we need to address them. But it's really important, I think, also, though, because there is so much, I don't know, Doug, whether it's misinformation or delusional thinking, because all of these things are possible, intentionally going down a certain path. I don't know, but we want to try and make some sense out of all this. And kind of to bring people up to speed, there have been some additional activities, even overnight. Russia has been accelerating its advance in Ukraine's east. I saw some graphically depicted information. We've shown this graph in the last week or so that the New York Times published a month ago, showing how since I think June of this year, the increases by the Russian in square kilometers captured has been substantially increasing each month, almost doubling the previous month. Last month saw, I think it was somewhere around 500 square kilometers, and now then so far in November, and we still have about a week to go, Russia has exceeded that by almost 100 square kilometers. And now that in the last week, it's 200 some odd kilometers. I mean, they're really starting to escalate. There was also overnight, actually, 188 drone strike throughout the depth of the Ukraine from Russian side. That was also accompanied by some Iskander missiles, and at least according to reports, most of the drones were shot down, which is not uncommon. Many of them got through. All of the Iskander missiles found their targets as well. Everywhere you look, Doug, it looks like things are just falling apart at an increasing rate for the Ukraine side.
I think that's true for Ukraine. We also need to pause and look carefully at what's happening on the Russian side, which is far more telling in my judgment. One of the things that we see right now is an enormous influx of food, water, fuel, and ammunition. All of the vehicles, wheeled or tracked, that need repair or need to be fixed in some way are being repaired. On the Russian side, it's very obvious. All of the soldiers are enjoying warm showers and great food, and large numbers of additional troops are pouring into the region. It looks like the Russians have earmarked about 180,000 troops for use in what looks like a building offensive. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because the Ukrainian resistance is broken, it's destroyed. The use of these deep strike weapons that you were talking about earlier, we had some strikes over the weekend again, this time aimed at Kursk, ostensibly at an airfield, and designed to destroy some Russian air defenses. These things are pinpricks that do nothing to fundamentally change the course of the war. And at the same time, the Russians are now preparing to end this. It's very clear. Now, what does that mean? Where will they go? Will they strike at Kiev? Will they strike at Dnipro? I'm sure they will in some fashion. They'll move forward because there's really nothing to stop them right now. And frankly, this is why the notion that we are somehow or another going to show up and begin to bully or dictate to the Russians what they will or will not do is ridiculous. And the other thing is that we should keep in mind is these preparations are not just, I think, to end the Ukraine war, because these masses of troops and capabilities aren't really required for that anymore. I think we're also seeing the Russians prepare to fight NATO. And I think that's because of some of the really incautious and stupid remarks being made by Starmer from Britain, Macron in Paris, that they're prepared to put troops on the ground in Western Ukraine. And frankly, the Russians have taken these seriously, and they're prepared to fight, which is something we cannot say about us.
We cannot, and it's ironic that we keep going down these paths of rhetoric and even some actions. And yet, when you look at the capacity in our defense industrial base, our actual armed forces, our fighting forces, literally still to this day spread to the four winds, and we don't have anywhere near enough concentrated manpower that's trained up and ready to fight. It's very odd why we're taking such risks, but indeed we are. And in fact, President Biden, this is in Washington Post just this morning, even though his term is coming to an end, even though now, what is it, a month and a half, even though he's had the better part of 3 years to try and change the dynamics on the battlefield through all the things that he's done, he's now trying to rush stuff in and saying, yeah, as soon as we can before Trump comes into office, we have to get as much stuff to Ukraine as we can. One should ask, towards what end? As best you can understand, and I know you're connected to a lot of different folks, what is Biden trying to accomplish by getting this stuff into Ukraine before he leaves office? What's the end state?
Well, clearly he's trying to tie Trump's hands. He's trying to make it impossible for Donald Trump to chart a new course in American foreign and defense policy. The bad news is, based on the most recent remarks by this new national security advisor, Waltz, there doesn't appear to be a determination to make any changes that make sense. And we've heard from him. We've heard from Gorka, the new deputy national security advisor, that, we're going to demand things of the Russians and push them to do things. And if they fail to respond, well, then we'll just turn on the spigot and dump more money and equipment and capabilities supposedly into Western Ukraine.
Yeah, and actually, Doug,
the whole thing is an exercise in self-delusion. We don't have much to send. And if we send much more, we won't have anything to use if we should need it. I think that's the quickest way to characterize that.
Yeah, and for those who may have missed it, this is still a head shaker to me. Here is Sebastian Gorka making that comment you just mentioned.
He will say, I'll give one tip away that the president has mentioned. He will say to that murderous former KGB colonel, that thug who runs the Russian Federation, you will negotiate now, or the aid that we have given to Ukraine thus far will look like peanuts. That's how he will force those gentlemen to come to an arrangement that stops the bloodshed.
Wow. You talk about Biden trying to tie Trump's hand before he gets into office. I mean, saying something like that from inside Trump's inner circle that is so detached from reality or acknowledges anything you just mentioned about the growing Russian side and how they don't have to negotiate from a position of weakness or subjected to that kind of pressure. Gosh, one wonders what Trump is actually trying to do.
Well, he comes across like Tony Blinken with a beard. Which is pretty disturbing. And again, this leads us back into the discussions we've had previously about the uniparty. And I'm sure that there are many people that voted for Donald Trump that are sort of scratching their heads. Others are beginning to say, I didn't vote for this. I voted for something very different. Who is really in charge? I mean, all these questions keep coming up because most of these cabinet picks, there are some exceptions, but many of them are pretty disturbing. And I think we're going to see evidence for that in the weeks and months ahead if nothing changes. And I don't think much will.
Well, if the recent statements by the current administration are any example, pretty much hard to argue with any of that. This is Sabrina Singh, deputy spokesperson for the Department of Defense. Was asked in a recent interview during a press briefing, aren't we risking escalation just at the time we need to be thinking about finding an end?
I know that you say that you don't want a wider war and that you don't want it to escalate, but it looks like it is kind of escalating from both
U.S.
sides.
forces aren't in the fight. You don't see, the only other foreign country that's been brought into this fight is North Korean soldiers on the battlefield. But you're not seeing, U.S. fighters on the ground, and that's not the intention of this administration.
You're right. You're saying that Russia invaded Ukraine. That's correct. You're saying that North Korean soldiers were brought into the battlefield. That's correct. Yep. The fact is that things are escalating and other countries are getting dragged into this. So, like, are you concerned that this escalation is accelerating at a speed that no one would really like?
I think we're always going to be concerned by the reckless rhetoric coming out. We are certainly concerned by the escalatory moves and acknowledging your point that Russia is making when it comes to employing DPRK forces on the ground. We acknowledge that is escalatory, and that would be met with a response. And that's what we're working with Ukraine on and continuing to support them on the battlefield.
Now, let me ask you a couple things about that exchange there, Doug. She says that, this is about the escalation on the Russian side of the North Korean troops, et cetera. But to this date, I still have not seen any evidence of the actual combat in there. I've seen some reports of North Korean troops being in there, but even if it was all true and there were actually 10,000, that's a really minor number in terms of the somewhere around 700,000 Russian troops that are inside of Ukraine right now. What do you make of this justification for us escalating with long-range weapons because of that?
Well, I've seen no evidence for any North Korean military presence on the ground in Ukraine, period. None. Now, I'm sure somebody with inventive software skills could create, with the use of artificial intelligence, a picture showing North Koreans somewhere. I haven't seen that. I think it's all nonsense, but it's a convenient lie. It's part of the larger narrative. It's important to the people that have been lying to the American people and to the West for almost 3 years now, that they now focus again on things that don't exist but seem threatening. And the idea of large numbers of Korean troops showing up and marching west is frightening to Europeans. It also plays to this utterly false narrative that Russia is weakening, that Russia doesn't have manpower, that Russia can't do anything. You know, how many times have we heard this nonsense only to discover that it was all nonsense? I hope people, but I'm not very optimistic about this, but I hope people will step back and say, wait a minute, show us the evidence. There's no evidence for this. You know, we used to have this commercial, where's the beef? Well, there's no beef. And that's disturbing because it's just more lies on top of more lies.
You know, we had, and I won't play it right now, but we had some clips we've previously shown of Sergei Lavrov back in September when the whole issue of long range weapons was really kind of first hit a crescendo when Zelensky was in town for the UN General Assembly and was lobbying everyone he could to get permission to use those. And Russia came out and Lavrov especially said, hey, we will consider this as the direct participation of the West if you do this. And we will adjust our nuclear doctrine as a result. And of course, we know now then that they have formally acknowledged that their nuclear doctrine, their threshold was lowered. And then after the long range weapons were used a week or so ago for the first time, now Russia has fired this Oreshnik missile, which is a hypersonic missile, which by all accounts that we can find out, cannot be intercepted by Western means. And this thing can literally be used anywhere on continental Europe, even right now. So given those realities, one might ask, why are we risking potential escalation that could go nuclear when there is absolutely nothing tactically to gain for the Biden administration between now and January 20th?
Well, it certainly speaks to the irrationality that governs the United States and Western Europe. There's no question about that. Part of it is that the people that are in power right now cannot retreat from the stupid policy positions that they've taken for years. If they were to stand up and say, well, the truth is the war is lost, there's nothing we can do about it, and so we're going to have to live with whatever the Russians ultimately decide they want, is impossible. If you say that, then you are capitulating. No one wants to capitulate to the truth. So that's part of it. The other part of it is ideological, and the belief that with the help of the mainstream media and control of the narratives that come out of the intelligence services, you can shape people's views. And there is some truth to that. People's views have been shaped. I get things all the time. What about these North Koreans? Well, where are they? Well, I've seen pictures. Well, those are all in Eastern Siberia. You know, it's all nonsense. But unfortunately, it has an impact. So I think that's part of it. Voting these people out has turned out to be very, very much in everybody's interest in Europe and here in the United States. And I think the Europeans are going to struggle harder to do it than we have. But now we see evidence for the same kinds of thinking and behavior and attitudes showing up in what we thought would be a fundamentally new administration that would break with the recent past. It's not happening.
So let me ask you something, Doug, from your and actually our joint past. I remember before we went to fight in Iraq in Desert Storm in 1991. You had told us you were then the operations officer, the S3 of our cavalry squadron, that we were going to be fighting the Republican Guard in Kuwait, et cetera, as part of that big left hook that the U.S. went on, et cetera. You told us something I never left me, is that you called everybody together and you really graphically, all the leaders especially, explained what the Ukraine or what the Iraqi side was like, what their training had been like, what their maintenance had been like, what their logistics, the air defense, all these kinds of things. You graphically showed why we would win. You said it is clear as can be. It is black and white. We will dominate, devastate, and here's the reasons why. And you had on the other side at the time, even in the Western media, they were talking about it's the fifth largest army in the world. They've battle hardened from the Iran-Iraq war of the 8 years before that, et cetera. And you just blushed that aside. You said it doesn't matter what they're saying. It doesn't matter what Baghdad Bob, their guy, was talking about, how it's the mother of all battles, et cetera. You said, forget about that. Here's the reality. And then we went out and actually did the reality and saw it. No, it doesn't matter what anybody else spun. That's what actually happened. In this case here, all the stuff you talked about a second ago with the increasing Russian capacity and the decreasing Ukrainian and Western capacity, if those things are actually proven on the ground, no spin is going to work for that. I mean, how do you see that unfolded?
The greatest concern I have is as the Russians advance and really end this conflict and demonstrate conclusively that there's nothing we can do about it, that there will be great pressure in Washington to quote unquote employ a nuclear weapon. This business with the hypersonic missile, this Oreshnik, is a product of decades of research, development, and investment. This all began in the 70s and the early 80s under Marshal Garkov. He was seeking alternatives to the use of nuclear weapons. Remember, he was the commander-in-chief of Soviet rocket forces and then became the chief of what we would call today probably the Great General Staff. He wanted something other than nuclear weapons. Well, this developed and it evolved, and that's where we are today. And one of his disciples is Mahmoud Gareev, a colonel general, very brilliant man, wrote several books. And he made it very clear that we could wage war, that is, the Russians could wage war without reliance on nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons were ultimately self-defeating because they were poisonous and too destructive. The missile that you saw is now the answer. There is an arsenal of those missiles waiting to be launched. This is not a one-off. This is not just a few experimental missiles. And this is the problem, that once it becomes clear we have nothing with which to respond, that some damn fool is going to say, well, let's use a low-yield nuclear warhead. On the assumption, that won't start a major war. And again, the Russians are prepared. Their nuclear forces are on high alert. They're ready to fight, whether you fight on the tactical, conventional level, operational, conventional, or strategic nuclear. They're ready for it all. They're ready to attack and respond. This is the time for President Trump to tell everyone that's working for him to shut up. And he should take the mic and he should say, number one, I didn't start this war. I don't want this war, and I want to end this war, period. And any further discussion of this until I am in office is counterproductive. And I will talk directly to President Putin, and we will find a solution and bring this tragic war to a close. I think he should do some other things. I think he should suspend all aid immediately and stop this mass destruction and annihilation of the Ukrainian people by their own government. He should suspend all that aid, and then he should withdraw all U.S. personnel from Ukraine, in and out of uniform, whether they're intelligence operatives or anything else. All U.S. citizens out. Do those things, and that will signal to the Russians, excuse me, that we are very serious, and then they will take us seriously. But right now, with Vice Admiral, whatever his name was, at strategic, what is it, Strategic Force Command or something, Strike Command, saying ridiculous things about our readiness to engage in nuclear war, or somebody like Gorka, newly announced radio personality speaking for the president, scary thought, or Waltz talking about no daylight between him and
Jake Sullivan.
Sullivan, good Lord. I mean, why did we all flock to the polls and vote for President Trump?
Yeah, we needed some daylight there.
We might as well bail out of this election and start over.
Yeah, the real problem that we're in right now, Doug, is it's getting increasingly difficult to get to January 20th when Trump could issue orders to the extent that you're talking about here. And those headlines that Gary was showing just illustrate the danger here, because apparently the Biden administration has continued to give authorization to use long-range weapons even after the Reshnik is, and now then Russia is saying that they're going to respond already. And I fear that this is actually going to lead to an escalation. But then you have knuckleheads like General David Petraeus, which I don't know why anyone still listens to him, said this yesterday.
I don't think we're on the cusp of World War III, but the risks are enormous. I think we face the greatest number of challenges and risks, at least since the end of the Cold War, if not since the end of World War II. And one of those is the most complex we've had. And that is, of course, the U.S. and Western relationship with China. What we have to do is remember that the elements of deterrence, and of course, what we're trying to do in many of these cases, particularly in the case with China, is to deter something that we don't want to see develop because it could lead to actual conflict. The relationship is described by the U.S. National Security Advisor as one of intense rivalry, intense competition. And we want to make sure that intense competition doesn't turn into actual confrontation. The way you do that is deterrence. Deterrence rests on a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other.
Okay, so he's kind of right in the last part there, where he's saying that deterrence is based on an accurate understanding of your adversary's capabilities and your willingness to do here. But if by that calculation, according to what you just said, we should not be trying to provoke them further.
No, obviously not. Historically, the United States has never had any vital strategic interest in eastern Ukraine, or for that matter, in Ukraine. Our interests always ended at the border of NATO, at least for the last 80 years, and we keep pushing it further east, which has brought us into conflict with Russia. Something with which Putin and his government have tried for 15 years to avoid. We have continued to push, and provoke. Now we've got the war. We're not in a good position. We're not capable or available to fight for much of anything. We're provoking another war down in the Middle East. These two wars can no longer be viewed separately. What you do to the Russians in Ukraine to obstruct them or to harm them is going to redound to our disadvantage in the Middle East. That is assuming that anyone wants to avoid a war involving Israel and the United States against virtually everyone in the region, plus Russia and China and others. This is mindless. This is stupid, and it's not going to work. It's going to fail miserably, but we're back to where we started. How can any of these people that have made ridiculous statements for so long retreat from these bad policy positions? Their egos won't permit it, and their ego is much more important than the interests of the United States and the American people.
Yeah, apparently it is to them. Now, one development that might be at least eking in the right direction is there was a report out just this morning produced by Julian Rupke, who's a German writer and researcher that has been covering the Russia-Ukraine war really from the beginning. He is avowedly pro-Ukrainian. He likes their side. He's been for them the whole time. I think he has a little Ukrainian flag on his X account. But he's also one of the most honest guys out there. And when the Ukraine side hasn't been doing good, he's talked about it. Well, he had a report out that had several important elements today, which will show from a pro-Ukraine side, things are not going the way Jake Sullivan and some of these other people claim, or that Biden thinks that they actually have a shot, et cetera. And there's several important categories. I want to look at some of them here and get your feedback on them. And on the back side of this, we're going to see how there is somebody else in the United States, a former general officer, who doesn't seem to be getting the memo. But we'll save that for a second. First of all, let's take a look at Rupke, because he's talking about some views that are not shared very widely on the West about what's happening on the southern part of the Eastern Front.
However, it only reached about 12 kilometers that took around 3 months to fight for from the Ukrainian side at the time, and 12 kilometers that Russia has now covered in just 1 week. Towards Velyukhanovostika, we are looking at footage that shows us the Russian army is just outside the city. And these are the recordings that Russian bloggers have published. And we can clearly see the Russian tanks down here. These are 3 armored vehicles moving forward in the direction of the last line of defense before they reach the city, specifically towards that industrial facility standing here. And in the background, it is quite clear you can see the buildings of Velyukhanovostilka, which have long been a vital retreat point for the Ukrainian army, from where numerous attempts were made to advance last year, ever since the front has come to a halt there. And it has been roughly around 5 days in total. 5 days in which Russia managed to successfully capture an area measuring 70 square kilometers here and break through the Ukrainian front on a width of about 13 kilometers.
That was so important, because just before that clip there started, he was talking about how much territory the Ukraine side captured in their 2023 full-scale offensive, which started around Velyukhanovostilka and had moved 12 kilometers in 3 months and never went any further. And now he says that the Russians are advancing so fast, as we talked, they got that in 5 days. And of course, it's continuing to roll on. So based on that acceleration in the southern part, do you see any reason to think that Russia is going to slow down now?
Oh, of course not. In fact, the more we talk about what we will try to do in negotiating with the Russians in terms of forcing them or pushing them into some corner that we want, the more likely we're to see this end. Remember, the Russians were quite content to sit on most of the territory that they were interested in, where Russian-speaking people lived, for quite a while. And the Ukrainians obliged them by impaling themselves on defenses they could never penetrate, and losing we think now, over 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, a total of probably 1.5 million casualties overall. I mean, these are World War I scale numbers, as we've discussed before. It's a no-win scenario for Ukraine, and the Russians have not been in any hurry. But now we know they are building up for a massive undertaking. I suspect that will be designed to end this conflict on their terms. And what are we going to do? Are we going to escalate to the nuclear level? Somebody mentioned recently on some show or some event somewhere that we would consider giving the Ukrainians nuclear weapons. That is Zelensky. I don't really see this any longer as Ukrainian. It's just the Zelensky regime, a nuclear weapon. Well, you'd have to be insane to do such a thing.
Well, let's hope that that's just a rumor that someone wants to be true on the Ukraine side, but nobody with any sanity, even marginal sanity, one would hope, in the United States would submit to that. One of the second thing he talked about here, which I think is really, really important, because it gets to the sustainability part on the Ukraine side. Many people want to say we just need to give them more stuff and more arms and ammunition. That's the real thing. And then that troops will be able to hold on to it. But as you have been saying forever, war is about men, not machines, not about money. It's not a matter of how much stuff you give. It's a matter of the people that can use them. And in this clip right here, Rupke shows something I think I'm not sure he intended to, but it really shows the paucity of the capacity of the Ukrainian military. Watch this.
We just saw that armored vehicles were used, but now we also see these buggies or quads, these small units that Russia is utilizing. They are unarmored. It's a suicide mission for them if they get hit. However, if they succeed in getting past the Ukrainian lines, they are actually quite fast. They do 50 to 60 kilometers per hour in the field, even in time lapse, and can, in a very short amount of time, bypass the Ukrainian lines, successfully flank Ukraine, and then proceed all the way to the center of the city. push forward or at least get close to the city. We just saw this industrial facility, which apparently was the target of this Russian offensive. And we now see that Russian soldiers are inside with these defense lines, which we can see here, good bunkers. We can also see this on the side. This has been built over months, the whole thing, that they were conquered by the Russians. We have images too, which we won't show, of dead Ukrainian soldiers. Yet again, and this is likely the big problem, there were only a few Ukrainian soldiers, a handful maybe, who have defended this major position. We'll see it again shortly in another material. There is also significant criticism from the Ukrainian civil society and military experts that the trenches Ukraine has prepared, along with the very, very sophisticated installations, we note that they weren't occupied or properly staffed, allowing the Russians to advance easily without much resistance.
So do you see there, even in the few places where they actually did build good defenses, they don't have enough people to man them. And if those major positions that they spent a lot of time building aren't even manned properly, now Russia's just rolling in. The question is, how much more can they defend areas further?
No, I don't think they can do much of anything. That's why these revenge weapons are so pointless and counterproductive. This is a point in time where someone who cared about Ukraine, whether they're in Washington or Kiev or London or Paris, should be concerned about the surviving Ukrainian people and the few men that they have left. But there doesn't seem to be any interest in that. I think from the beginning, the only interest was in harming Russia. That's failed miserably. Russia is stronger and more capable now than it's ever been. Ukraine is a lost cause. And we plan to try and make it worse. I mean, these people are not just whistling past a graveyard. They risk putting us in the graveyard too, because the only way that we could persuade the Russians to stop in the minds of many people is for us to up the ante. In other words, to include the use of a tactical nuclear weapon on the end of a Tomahawk or some other kind of missile. This is very dangerous. It needs to go away. We need to put an end to this. But for the reasons we've already discussed, nobody wants to do it.
Well, listen, it's getting to a point to where we may run out of options, and one doesn't. It's Gary's again showing you more new headlines. These are new. These weren't even out there when we started the show here. That Russia is really serious about some kind of retaliation. Putin said during his comments after the first set were fired, after he fired the Oreshnik, that he said additional strikes would likely be coming in a combat environment. So I can only imagine that something else is escalatory is going to come. Who knows what's going to get here. But the other area that again shows the problem with the Ukrainian personnel was in the actions up in the Kursk area. And as we talked about many times, actually, over the months, that was always a fool's errand. It never had any operational or certainly not strategic meaning for the Ukraine side, but they have been just losing terrible amounts of people. And then Rubka shows just how bad it is now.
We plan on venturing further into the Kursk region situated in the western part of Russia, and unfortunately the news coming from Ukraine to that area is not looking very good either. On the one hand, we see that the Russians have received massive support. We used to always say the 810th Marine Infantry Brigade was deployed there with several thousand soldiers. They were quite decimated by the Ukrainians, losing over 120 tanks and armored carriers. However, the Russians sent reinforcements, visible here with the flag. And now we see the Ukraine acknowledges that at least 40% of the territory it was still controlling by mid-August has sadly been lost.
Because they don't have the personnel to hold it. Even though they've been flooding the place with all these reinforcements, it still is not enough because Russia has plenty more reinforcements. Without any North Korean troops, it should be pointed out, the Russians themselves have plenty of troops, and they are now methodically just decimating this whole area and all the Ukraine troops going in with it. Now, one would rationally think, okay, when you now see all across the front, from the south all the way through the eastern front up into the northern part with the Kursk operation, everything is literally falling apart in front of our eyes. The Ukraine side doesn't have enough manpower to hold it. Russia is increasing its manpower drive, so the end is ordained. It is clear. But then you have on a recent interview with the former National Security Advisor and former General H.R. McMaster, he seems to forget or ignore those realities and seems to display a different preference.
And you see Russia throwing troops into Ukrainian defenses. I mean, they're taking tens of thousands of casualties a month. I think it's really an unsustainable rate. And what the Ukrainians are doing now is trying to protect themselves from the onslaught, inflict as many casualties as they can, and they're trading some space for time and the opportunity to cause more attrition on Russian forces.
Now, leaving aside from the fact that there's no evidence that tens of thousands of Russians are being casualties every month, he implies that there is a coherent, cogent strategy on the Ukraine side that they're trading space for time in order to, well, he never gets to that part there. What do you make of that analysis?
Well, it's ridiculous. It bears no resemblance to reality. But this is not new. We've been hearing these reports of enormous numbers of casualties from the Russian side forever. They don't take any. They haven't had any. I mean, look, if you were to look at it roughly in terms of proportions, I would say for every 6 to 7 Ukrainians that have been killed, 1 Russian has been killed. Yeah, and then if you go into the wounded category, it goes much higher on the Ukrainian side because they have no infrastructure with which to evacuate the wounded and save their lives any longer. All of that was destroyed in the first couple of years. The tragedy here is that that's fundamentally false. And no one is going to question it until everything falls apart. And as I said before, one gets the impression that to sort of save face, there's this notion that we can threaten the Russians on the nuclear level and that they will somehow or another then beat a hasty retreat. That's not true. That's not going to happen. So, the whole business of trading space, that's something the Russians did early on. They saw no value in ground in most cases. Ground only has value if it provides you with an advantage over your enemy. And everyone thought from the very beginning that Russia was interested in capturing all this territory. Never was. That's fundamentally false. The Russians want to put an end to this. They want a neutral Ukraine, whatever that turns out to be. And on the Austrian model, we keep resisting it. As long as we resist it, the war will continue. We believe that we can outlast the Russians. I don't think so. I think the Russians, if this is a competition of competitive collapse as existed in World War I, the Russians can definitely win it. We cannot. And we're overstretched, as you know, not just in Europe, but also down in the Middle East. The European forces are in no position to take on the Russians. Most of them, quite frankly, are pathetic. The Ukrainians are dead.
No
there
one.
aren't many of them left. So who are we kidding? It makes no sense.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because you see no effort in any of the Western countries you're talking about to have gone on to like a mobilization or even not necessarily bringing people into new, but to mobilize for war their actual forces and to maybe to bring reserve forces onto active duty, et cetera. None of that has happened at all. And that's all necessary for you to actually go to war with the side who has done all of that stuff. Yet they still keep making all these comments. I mean, I've seen recent stuff from Poland, UK, ready to fight tonight against Russia, so they say. The Lithuania, the new Sweden, and the Netherlands. All these folks keep saying they're ready to war, but none of them seem to be and oblivious to what's going to happen. Now, let me ask you in the last few minutes that we have here today, if the Russians make good on this threat that Gary just showed you on the headlines a minute ago, and they do take retaliation for what happened here, and it's another, hypersonic missile somewhere that hits something meaningful. Now, there's a couple of possibilities, and I'd like your view on both. One is that they'll hit something in Ukraine that's important to NATO. The second is that they may do what many in the Russian side have been begging for a long time, and they hit something outside of Ukraine in a NATO territory. Would you speak to what you think if either of those things happen?
I think the first thing that the Russians are going to do now with a vengeance is eliminate the logistical support structure, what's left of it. And that means destroy transportation networks, primarily rail and secondarily good roads where trucks can carry ammunition and replacements forward. That's going to happen. Command and control centers, clearly they're going to be destroyed. Anything, anywhere that can support an aircraft, any landing strips, any airports, any airfields, they will be destroyed. And that is critical to the advance of Russian forces. The Russians will move their air defense forward, their integrated air defenses, to cover the entirety of Western Ukraine before they're through. Everything will be deliberately moved. That's how you avoid casualties, because if you don't systematically move forward your integrated air defenses, and theirs are far more elaborate than anything we have, you risk taking unnecessary casualties. And right now, we know from studies that have been performed at NATO headquarters and elsewhere that we'd be fortunate to defend 5% of NATO territory in terms of air and missile defense.
Yeah.
Be done. Those things will happen first. Now, if we show no signs of relinquishing, our position, changing our position, or threatening further the Russians, then I think they could move on to destroying positions in Romania, certainly in Poland, parts of Lithuania, no question about it. Of course, then we'll argue, you see, this is the evil Russians attacking. We must go now to a nuclear holocaust in terms of righting the wrongs. So it's crazy. I hope we don't. That's why this needs to end. If ever we needed strong presidential leadership in Washington to step forward and say, enough, over, done, stop, this is it. But
Yeah.
I see no evidence for a new national military strategy. I see no evidence for a new national strategy revolving around energy, agriculture, and high-tech manufacturing. I see nothing. I hear empty phrases, empty words. And this is not going to get us very far. We talk about mass deportations. I see no evidence for a process and a plan. How do you do this? Is this gradual? Is this all at once? How are you going to, first of all, and most important, secure the border? And finally, we need to understand something, and you know this from your own experience as an American. Presidents do not succeed who end up at war. They fail miserably. FDR's New Deal died with the outbreak of World War II. LBJ's Great Society and War on Poverty died because of Vietnam. We've got to get out of this. The answer right now is stop the wars. Get out of these. We do not have to fight these. This is the thing that was depressing. There's no particular reason why we should be at war with the Russians, period. This notion of China, that's equally crazy and delusional. That we should be concerned about an island 6,000 miles from the United States that operated historically as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy against China. Why should we be concerned about that? That is a Chinese concern, a valid strategic concern. We refuse to see anyone else's interests as legitimate. Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine. We have legitimate interests in Mexico, in Cuba, in the Caribbean basin. Look, these are facts. I don't give a damn whether somebody says, well, that's right or wrong. I don't hear anybody raising this issue about the United States and its legitimate security interests in the Caribbean basin or Central America or Mexico. On the contrary, I hear the opposite. Why aren't we doing more? So the bottom line is this is all nonsense. It all needs to stop. There will be no further advance of Russian forces into Eastern Europe unless we make it clear that they must in order to secure themselves.
Yeah.
Ukraine's principal mission in the world today should be neutral, should be as a neutral state, a place where it all ends, not begins.
Which is certainly would have been in the best interest of the Ukrainian people as well as Europe and the United States. Everyone would have benefited from that, but we can't undo that from the past. Now we just have to hope we don't gum it up even worse now, that it could make it go catastrophically bad. But we'll have to wait and see how that works out. But Colonel, thank you for coming back on today and sharing these insights. It's something that Americans and people around the world really need to hear.
Well, happy Thanksgiving to you, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone who's listening. And let us go home, be grateful for the country we have, the prosperity and the peace that we enjoy, and demand that the new leadership end this pointless conflict, not perpetuate it, not extend it, as appears to be the case with some of the new appointees.
Well, now that's something I would give a lot of thanks for if that actually happens. Thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys. Be sure and join us actually not long from now, about 10 minutes or so. We have Patrick Henningsen on today. He's going to talk specifically about this Oreshnik missile. You don't want to miss that. 10 minutes, Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We'll see you very soon.